Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you about a brand new project in OpenStack called Cyborg. It doesn't happen too frequently, so it's kind of exciting to be there when something kicks off. But mea culpa, I'm presenting this for my colleague who wasn't able to travel, so keep your complicated questions to the IRC channel and the people that actually know what they're talking about. So it's a new project, like I said. It's based around acceleration and accelerated hardware, GPUs. And it's gone from being an interesting option to a necessity for a lot of telco providers. And a little bit of background. It did come from telco requirements. There's some open NVFV requirements and ETSI. And about a year ago from that, a new project called Nomad was established to address these requirements. But there's a transition going on because the initial goals were too limited. And so there was some work done with a scientific working group over the last year to sort of understand what acceleration management is. A lot of these discussions were at the Barcelona summit. And because of that, they formally established a new project called Cyborg. And the scientific working group did some background research and set up a lab and played with this. And they came with a couple of conclusions. Very basic, that GPUs can be used in OpenStack. That's good, because we wouldn't have a project if they decided that they couldn't be used. And there was a lot of KVM tuning that was required to get anything close to acceptable performance. And of course, there's two options. There's heterogeneous, where you have a mix of GPU and CPU. And the good part is, well, CPU resources are available for all the workloads. But on the bad side, the scheduler doesn't prioritize GPU workloads. And then you can go to an all GPU host aggregated model. And then you get all of the acceleration, but then the CPU-only workloads underutilize the GPU hosts. So this is kind of fast forward into the early part of the project. What do we want? Well, we want to be able to list accelerators. And you'll actually see these. This CLI is already implemented, and I'll show that to you guys in a little bit. They want to identify and discover any attached accelerators to hardware and be able to attach them and detach them to an instance. And then, of course, to install and uninstall a driver for a particular accelerator. So what is Cyborg? It's a general management framework for accelerators. I believe the comment we have the longest team meetings is because the PTL has a history of not closing the meeting at 12 o'clock midnight, and it's still open the next day with a lot of complaints from the other people that are supposed to use the same meeting room. So general architecture is actually very similar to a lot of OpenStack services. If you know Ironic, it's very symmetrical. We have an API, RESTful interface, of course, a conductor doing a lot of the intelligence with a back-end database, and an agent that's talking to the various drivers. And the green, I think, represents most of what they've got working right now. So there's obviously a Cyborg generic driver as one of the first pieces that they worked on. Little definition breakdown. So they're looking for a general management framework with resource discovery, lifecycle management. And then for accelerators, they're looking at the various different accelerators that are out there, DPDK, SPDK, and so on, and various different hardwares, FPGA, GPU, and so on. This is the timeline. So you can see it's very new. February 2016, Nomad was established. They redesigned everything in October 2016. And then the good news was at the Queen's PTG in Denver, just a month ago, they became an official project, so the technical committee approved them. And so they're aiming for their 1.0 release in Queens next February. They intend to be used either standalone or together with Nova for bare metal. And this is a Nova interaction example. And I'll pause a bit if anyone wants to take a picture. You can see it's kind of the same picture we had before. The important part here is using a placement API to talk to Nova. So they're following very well-known structural architecture that a lot of OpenStack services do. And they think that's going to accelerate their development because they're not reinventing the wheel here. They're providing extra intelligence to Nova. And here's an example of an OVS-DPDK interaction. I won't go into it too much, but come see me afterwards because I think I've worked my way through it pretty much. I'm waiting. So let's talk about the watts. They released some code for Pike, so you can actually go and start playing with it, which I was doing this week, and it's actually quite neat. So the basic framework went into Cyborg Pike, and what did they do? They got REST API working, the conductor and the agent, a generic stub driver, and a Devstack plugin, which I'll show you. And they did some initial documentation and testing materials. And these are the REST APIs that work. So there's two gets, a post, a put, and a delete. If you know anything about drivers or ironic, this will look very familiar to you. But basically, these basic CLI already works, the REST API. And this is an example of the Devstack plugin working, which is kind of cool that they got that up and running. So what are they working on right now? They're working on the Queen cycle for its first official release. And this architectural roadmap, so I asked them to do this to kind of show where they're at right now and what's coming up in the future. So the light green is already being implemented, the API, the conductor, and the agent. The dark green is their priority for Queens. So the database, the reporting, there's the feedback loop, and the generic driver are all being worked upon. And the mustard, I guess, is rocky possibilities, and I suspect that they're going to get some of these done in Queens as well. And then the red is sort of out of scope, the vendor-specific drivers. So that would be the next part when the project becomes more accepted by the community, and we can get the domain experts coming in and adding their flavor to Cyborg. So you can go ahead and look at the Etherpad for the discussion for the Queen's release. So this lists in a lot more detail what they're planning to do. And they have some priorities. The Nova placement interaction is very simple and basic right now. And they want to do some end-to-end functional testing with at least one type of real backend, not just Devstack is how I translate that. And then their non-prioritized work item is to start looking at SBDK. So it is an open community. They are building it just like a normal OpenStack project. So there's a bunch of stuff that you can review on OpenStack.org. You can use the OpenStack-dev mailing list with acceleration or Cyborg. There's a wiki that has just about everything I presented, but in a lot more detail. They meet once a week. And you can look that they already have quite a good variety of companies working on it. Huawei, Red Hat, Lenovo, that's who I work for. A bunch of independents, Intel, Fujitsu, and so on. So it's already a nice shared community, which I personally always think is a really good sign with a new OpenStack project, because it's a sign that it's going to mature quicker and not be abandoned if there's just one or two companies involved. They are very interested in more resources. Obviously, if you have storage and or hardware acceleration experience, that would be wonderful. And just pop onto the IRC at OpenStack Cyborg and introduce yourself and ask what you can do to help. I think they have a lot of work for Queens and Rocky for sure. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.